Welcome everybody. I'm Dr. Michael Brown, President of MAOPS. I'd like to thank you here for what we've been titling our Fireside Chat series. We keep coming up with different names for it, but basically this has just been a web series where we have been reviewing osteopathic history, kind of getting back to our roots of what it means to be an osteopathic physician and learning about the treasure trove of information that is available to us from many resources. Returning with us is Jason Haxton. He is our world-renowned expert on the life of A.T. Still. Not only does he know the man as well, but he's able to take the stories from his life and apply them to our practice in medicine today. So he's an invaluable asset. And he's also got a special guest with him today, which we're going to bring up in just a minute here. But first off, just want to welcome you, Jason. Thank you for being here with us again tonight.
It's great to be with you. You've got great ideas, and we're going to have a lot of fun just like we did last time.
Perfect. Wonderful. We've got a great subject tonight. We are going to talk about some of the lessons that we've learned from osteopathic medicine's greatest failures. And we thought, what a better way to study success than to study failures. And for me, I think this is a very important topic because I feel like when we study failures, we learn, or at least we try to learn, how to not do them again. We've all heard the saying, those that do not study history are bound to repeat it. And I think that is absolutely true. And what better time in this world than to be studying the great things of osteopathic medicine that happened around the same time. I mean, our last series, which I encourage any of you on this presentation tonight to go watch the recording of our last lecture if you didn't catch it. But we talked about osteopathic medicine and its role in pandemics. And it's very interesting because the whole history of our profession started right before a major world pandemic. And here we are 100 years later going through a major world pandemic and trying to apply the things that we've learned over the last 100 years. And I think, and hopefully, as we talk about these failures, I hope we'll be able to see how far we've come as a profession and not see that we haven't really changed much at all. So hopefully Jason has some good news for us as we start to wrap this all up. But before we get started too much, Jason, I'd like you to introduce and welcome Heather Rudy, the Assistant Director of the Museum of Osteopathic Medicine. And, you know, last time we asked the question of what would happen if anything were to tragically happen to Jason, which we pray for every night, that nothing will, so we don't lose this treasure trove of information. And I think he's going to come up with this answer here with Heather. So I'm going to unmute her here. And Jason, maybe you could tell us a little bit about her as well.
Well, thank you, Dr. Brown. And it's true that I do have to write the definitive book on Dr. Still before I die. But being only 62 and healthy, I think I've got a few years. However, even my staff behind closed doors says, you know, whatever happens if Jason goes one day. And so one of the things we discuss is introducing some of the staff members so you know the resources, because we really do have with 80,000 to 100,000 artifacts and a web presence and an amazing staff. I wanted to help you see the people behind the scenes, and in this case, my assistant. And because MAOPS is located, you know, in Jefferson City, the headquarters, I want Heather to give us a little background about her work in Jeff City prior to coming to the museum.
Hello, everybody. I'm Heather Rudy, as Jason said, his assistant. And before I came to the museum, I actually worked as a registrar for the Missouri Department of Natural Resources Division of State Parks. So my job was, I was in charge of all the artifacts at all the different historic sites and state parks throughout Missouri. So I have a lot of history of Missouri background. I've been with the museum since 2011 and currently working really hard with the other staff members to try and get as much of our collection up online and cataloged and trying to help Jason find some of these stories that we didn't even know about, and we're uncovering new ones every single day. So it's been really great to be able to go through and be able to present your history to you.
And I think, like I said, I am so fortunate to have Heather because she has the museum background training with her master's degree and 10 years plus work, particularly with all the sites, which I think is about 81, 80-ish.
When I left the state, there was 84.
84. So you can
Yeah.
imagine only having one collection is a lot better than 84. And she does an excellent job. So Heather, thanks for just saying hi today. And again, a resource for you if I'm not around. Heather Rudy, again, is my number one support. And we're going to talk, our first item is actually going to be an artifact that Heather was able to dig up out of our collection because we discovered that the school started before 1892. But I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Brown to get us moving. And thanks again, Heather.
Wonderful, wonderful. Again, one other item of housekeeping is that this is a discussion, and so we'd love your impact and your info, your feedback. Please give it as we're going. The chat panel there, please open up your chat panel and feel free to type questions as we're going. Jason has his open, I have mine open, and we will bring it into the discussion as we're going. So please feel free to ask questions as we're going, so that way we can answer them for you during this. So just feel free to type them into the general questions there, and we'll go forward through the chat. So we're going to go back about 130 years now, as Jason was saying there. 1892 is the date that I'm familiar with of being, the start of osteopathic medicine. I think that was the code to our lockers or something like that at the school, just to make sure that we remembered that number. Very interesting as we were studying, when we were coming over this, we asked Jason, what are the biggest failures in osteopathic medicine? Because as we were learning about the history, you kept bringing up all these different times that we failed. And I think it's really interesting about his start in medicine, AT still start in medicine. And you mentioned, some of the pitfalls that he went through. Maybe you could describe some of those early failures or give us a brief overview in osteopathic medicine. And I know you've got some presentation to show us as well.
So yeah, we'll jump in and out of a PowerPoint. So you can actually see some of the artifacts that Heather has been able to not only catalog and help us restore and make sure they're safe for you, because we are a public trust. Actually, this stuff is your stuff, and our job is to make it as accessible as possible. So in this PowerPoint tonight will be one way that we'll do that. So I'm going to begin with sharing my screen for a little bit so that we can actually look at what you might not realize is that, see if it'll, yep, there she goes. Of course, again, I enjoyed Dr. Brown including the museum to do this because there's many ways that he could connect with MAOPS, but I think history is always a fun one because Dr. Still loves stories, and we're a profession of great stories. And again, here is our little schoolhouse with Dr. Still at it, and we still have that today. You can come visit it in Kirksville. But, his first attempt out of school was a fiasco. And this document is what tells us that. It's the annual address, but if you were to read it closely, it's January 1st, 1891, meaning the school has already been in existence for a year. So when we say 1892, actually the first school was started in 1890 and it was a failure. It's a good thing Dr. Still persevered or we wouldn't have jobs or a profession. But actually his idea, he was traveling the countryside and doing these miraculous healings. And obviously patients wanted to do it. Doctors who saw this new form of healthcare, they wanted to be a part of it. And Dr. Still being about 55 years old, that time 50 years was about a life expectancy, so he was well past his prime, and they're thinking if he dies, what he's learned will die with him. And so much like me having Heather Rudy as my backup, Dr. Still needed a backup. And so he decides to train some of these patients and a few doctors. And he calls his original school the School of Bones. So the American School of Osteopathy, which we know from 1892, was his second attempt. The first attempt was a failure. And why it was a failure is that the patients didn't have the medical knowledge and background that Dr. Still had gained in 55 years. And the doctors that he picked were all bleeding, blistering, dosing, poisoning doctors of the time. So they really didn't have a concept of what Dr. Still wanted to create. And many of them, after a year of training, they were ready to go and make money. This was an opportunity to them. And Dr. Still saw this opportunity for the people and help. He had the big picture in his mind. Those he was teaching had the small picture of themselves. And that's why it was kind of a failure. And almost all those doctors, Wilderson, within 2 years, he was ready to leave. So Dr. Still, these people he trained to be his resources were leaving. And they weren't very well trained. He actually thought that they were a bigger threat than they would be help. But he acquiesced and signed off on, yeah, you've learned a little bit, but don't work on women. And, here you go. And so this was kind of a failure. We look in this picture of the class, many of these first students, even in 1892, didn't graduate, but took the information Dr. Still gave them and made osteopathy kind of their own, and did a very bad job at it. They opened up schools. Stothers and Hall went across to the next state, Illinois, in Quincy, and they started their own institutes, charging people, and they themselves weren't that well trained. One of the faculty, A.P. Davis, he was one of those MDDOs. He claimed he could teach you in half the time, a Dr. Still at half the price. It was strictly money. By the way, A.P. Davis spent his whole life trying and doing things. He ended up becoming the first student of D.D. Palmer in chiropractic. And then he went on to say, it's not osteopathy, it's not chiropractic. I have invented neuropathy, and that is the way. But it really was just osteopathy. So these are a bunch of, all these students, as we look, all created their own schools, and they all failed. And so again, when we look at what was going on with Dr. Still, it was really kind of a miserable start. No wonder he just said, forget it. This is too much liability. I'm just going to do it, and it'll die when I die.
That's funny. I have a completely different definition of neuropathy today. So,
yes.
A funny definition there. But, interesting enough too, you mentioned to me once that his earliest students or his first students weren't even students at all. You mentioned that he used his children as his sort of his test students. I mean, talk about family medicine or the birth of some family medicine. Could you elaborate a little on that?
Well, here's the thing. Bone setting, which actually began in England, was passed from, parent to child through generations. And so there were these families that could do the manipulative medicine. And so it isn't unusual that A.T. Still first taught his own sons, and it proved to him that it was actually, it could be done, that they could, within reason, do good technique. And so that's what encouraged him to start the school, was the fact that he thought it could be taught. But the education of anatomy and medicine were so poor in these first students who had all the enthusiasm, but not the medical background. And it was the Europeans that came with the wealth of education that made Dr. Still said, I'll give it one more try. And it was the anatomy instructor, William Smith, who was an MD with 7 years of the Royal School of Surgery in Edinburgh, Scotland. He was equal to Dr. Still could talk to him and realize, we have quality. I'm ready to try again. And I'm glad he did, because the second school was a huge success. But it teaches us, you've got to have faculty that have the credentials and the teaching ability, or you're going to do more damage to patients. So, any experiences with that, Dr. Brown, from teachers you remember that made it really fantastic for you? Or you can give it a
Absolutely. There were tough times in medical school, and thank goodness there were some teachers that were still excited about medicine, because, there were some days where I felt it was only being able to pay off my student loans that kept me moving forward in medical school. And I always tell future or pre-medical students, I say, you know, don't ever talk to a medical student or a resident about whether or not they should go into medicine. Talk to somebody who's actually completed it all and gone through the whole process, you know, because they're going to give you the better view of, was it worth it or not? You know, it's really hard to talk to the guy carrying the heavy backpack up the mountain if it's worth it or not. It's better to talk to the guy that's already at the top of the mountain and has got a better view. So speaking of that, kind of going in there, you know, so you talk about this relationship between A.T. Still and William Smith. How did that help save osteopathic medicine?
Well, it really it gave A.T. Still credibility because his own education was 55 years of learning by doing. And you know, again, if you stick at it long enough and you're around enough doctors and doing your own thing, you will figure it out. But that was a long, a long course of study where Smith came in and could, you know, very quickly establish a school based on his own education. Because A.T. Still wasn't really familiar what all I should be teaching. You know, anatomy, obviously, but what else? Histology, pathology, how we set courses up, even how to bring in new faculty. These were things that the Europeans that came in were able to help establish. And so really our school grew from a shack to a major institution within about 3 years. And that's in itself was why it was successful, where these other people didn't have the resources to see beyond themselves. Dr. Still trusted other people. We always said osteopathy is about letting others be involved. It wasn't a single man calling all the shots. He started it, but he was open to what everyone would bring. And as he says, I will go and others will keep this moving. That's what is great about osteopathy. It's progressive.
So is it kind of safe to say that that first school, that first failure of school, was more because the attitude of the students was not towards treating patients or healing patients, but it was to, I'm going to make money off of osteopathic medicine itself, or the principles?
It seems that every one of them had a money motivation and not, I'm creating something new. And that's where Dr. Still, money never meant anything to him. And that's probably why he thought it might be better to stop than to put these kinds of people in the profession. That it'll destroy it anyway. So why even begin this path? And yet Smith was absolutely dedicated to Dr. Still's ideas and really moved his medical understanding to this was the better direction. And it gave Dr. Still credibility because it's like, well, what does this frontier man know? Well, with William Smith having the years of education in obstetrics and surgery and being able to say that this man is an equal, it permitted people to say, then okay, you're putting your credentials on this person's idea. It gave Dr. Still's research credibility from someone who was a person who could speak on it. So these things were very helpful in getting Dr. Still started. And then more and more great people came because they're attracted to, you know, they don't want to risk their reputation, but if this man is putting it out there, maybe there is something and I want to be part of it. So it really grew that way.
Jason, Brian Bowles is asking us what the tuition costs were when the school first started. Do you happen to know those ballpark figures off the top of your head?
Exactly. It was a 20-month course. You would do 10 months in a year, and then you take a break and come back for 10 more months. And for years, it was $500 for the full tuition for the 2-year experience. Now, if you were a physician, you didn't need all the background information, so you only had to go 10 months. So it was $250. It was assumed that you already had the basic skills, but your degree, your diploma was different. Your diploma said that you were a doctor osteopath as opposed to the full course diplomat initially, but then a doctor of osteopathy. So they actually got a different diploma stating that they already were a doctor and therefore only took 10 months. And it stayed $500 for a long time. And we're going to get to that when we get to the Association of College of Osteopaths. We're going to get to that cost and the number of years, and that's what created a conflict for what is ACOM today. but that's another debate.
I wish I could have bought my first semester's textbooks for under $500. So that would have been quite the steal there. So a little bit of inflation over the last few years. Let's go back to that relationship with Dr. Smith, because I know that played a key role in honestly saving the profession, if I understand correctly, particularly within talking about the Flexner report. And I was wondering if, before we get into that, because that's one of the big trials we first faced, or not first faced, but after the first failure of a school, and then we had our second school, then we had to face the Flexner report. For those on the call, could you give a brief background on what the Flexner report was, why it was so dangerous to medical schools in general, and then how we survived that whole fiasco? Because really, the fiasco of the first medical school led us to Dr. Smith.
Right.
And then Dr. Smith ends up helping us save the profession. Can you talk about how that happens?
Well, it's true. Dr. Brown, had we followed the path of those inept doctors that Dr. Still, and they were just nice people, we might have limped along for a few years, but when Flexner would have come in, we would have been one of the 60 schools, or I take it back, 100 schools that basically were wiped out. At the time of the Flexner report, there were 166 MD schools and 9 osteopathic schools. When Flexner was done, they closed 100 in a period of years, 100 medical MD schools. 2/3 of the schools closed. So that tells you how bad it was. So now here's what Flexner was about. Flexner wasn't even a doctor. He did have 2 siblings, 2 brothers that were doctors. One had gone to a fairly good medical school and was trusted. The other went to one of these 6 to 9 months proprietary schools, bleeding, burning, blistering. Some of you might not realize, until 1910, giving you mercury, calomel, or bleeding you was legitimate treatment. I mean, we're talking almost within the last 100 years. That was Missouri treatment from doctors. So it's, thank goodness we evaluated what we were training and eliminated schools that felt this was legitimate. And so what Flexner did, he was a teacher. And he was just teaching the pedagogy of how we teach. How do we teach kids? How do we teach older people? And he had to do a thesis. So he thought, well, we all use doctors. How do we train these people? But when he got into it, he realized people were calling themselves physicians who had no degree. They just go out and find the nastiest tasting herb, mix it with a little cocaine or a little alcohol, and sell it as Dr. Good. And basically those were the snake oil doctors. Now, some of them went to these proprietary schools for 6 to 9 months, read everything out of the book, never had a cadaver. And at the end of 9 months, they could do surgeries and prescribe drugs. So of course, there's a reason half the patients were dying in America. I think it was Thomas Jefferson who said, with only a 50% success rate, I don't think you should be licensed. And so that's why licensing wasn't really a big deal in America. You could apprentice. You kind of go up with the doctor of your choice, and when he says you're done, you're done. And then there were some decent European schools. Johns Hopkins would be one of those that's a European base, but we too are a European based school. Because what Smith did was he instituted the degrees. So Flexner actually been educated in Europe. So he was trying to bring the medical institutions of Europe to the United States. So to some degree, we were exactly what he wanted. But he was cleaning up the language and the DOMD. This was more confusion. He just wanted clean medicine. So when he looked at the 66 surviving MD schools and looked at the DO schools, he said, we'll just get rid of them. And of course, we came back and said, whoa, based on our background and our faculty had come from Harvard and Yale, some of the best sciences schools. And bottom line is like, no, we're not going to go away. We're going to take you to court. Well, Flexner backed off and his supporters backed off and left the DO schools alone. But here's the funny thing. They got so deep into medical education, and granted, they were crappy schools, but there were no doctors for the Midwest. So if they had removed the osteopathic schools, there would be no physicians because all our schools were in Kansas, Pennsylvania, Illinois, up in Minnesota. We were in the heart of America. And if you eliminated our schools, there would be no physicians at all. So the funny thing is, Flexner needed us, and it set kind of our tone for the rural, underserved family physician. We served that role very well, but as you know, we can do anything in the profession. But that's why today, 25% of all physicians are DOs, family docs, from that path Flexner put us on. So they couldn't get rid of us. They wanted to, and then they realized they couldn't. And so, but there's been a little bit of animosity from the MDs and DOs during those 100 years. I'm glad that's all been kind of put to rest. And there's respect and systems are coming together. I don't know, Dr. Brown, if you can talk about your experiences, working with MDs. I hear from old timers who said it was just hell. There was no respect, and it was a constant fight for your rights. And I get the feeling from students I talk today that that's not as much an issue.
No, and I'm from that, more later generation where I benefit from the work and the effort of the peers that I have had that have come before me. And so I haven't had to go through that kind of judgment and that kind of discrimination, as they would call it. But I've studied the history books well, and obviously there are many doctors practicing today that still remember those days. But thank goodness for them. And honestly, to me, it all ties together. When we talk about osteopathic failures and how we overcame them, I love connecting the dots here. We've got that first school failure that leads to Dr. Smith, who then gets us on that European track, which then allows us to survive this Flexner report. As you said, 100 medical schools closing, 0 DO school, osteopathic schools closing, but also creating a gap in these states where now we have to fill these gaps. And now osteopathic medicine, it's kind of like weeding out your garden. All you've got left are these 9 plants and lots of room to grow.
I like that.
So we grow as a profession because of it, and we become that family medicine profession that's a force to be reckoned with, and that people can't deny. And I benefit from that. Because I'm from the later where we've grown so big that, they can't deny we exist, and they can't deny that we can work alongside them. I went to a residency that was duly accredited. So we were osteopathic accredited, but we were also, we had MDs, and we worked side by side. And I'll tell you, I never felt any kind of discrimination or preference. We were judged based upon how good of a physician we were. And I will tell you, in taking the students at my residency program, even the MD residents wanted the DO students to follow them because they really liked the professionalism of those students and just kind of the backgrounds that they came from. So it was quite an interesting experience for me. So, that's where we are today from, that very first failure way back before 1892.
Well, and Dr. Brown, you mentioned the DO doctors never die and they never stop practicing. So with 6 kids and 1 on the way, I get the feeling you may be practicing till you're 90, because with 2, I'm bankrupt. No, but what I'm saying is we have an amazing record of physicians who love their work, and they're practicing in their 80s and 90s. And it's some of those 80-year-old doctors that were working in Kansas that told me that in the 60s, they removed their right to prescribe drugs in Kansas. The state said osteopaths can't prescribe drugs. And so they would go down to Texas, buy their pharmaceuticals, come back into Kansas, and then distribute them to their patients. So there were all kinds of discrimination and loop jumping in the 60s that, as you say, things you would never even dream today, but they had to fight for those rights. And that's what led to the California incident.
Maybe we'll get to that a little bit later too. I think, Jason, you've hit upon what I think should be one of our next ad campaigns for osteopathic medicine. DOs don't die. So we'll have to test that one with some test groups.
DOs don't die.
Yeah, DOs don't die.
They just keep working.
We'll find a way around it. You can try to keep us down all you want, but we'll find a way around it, even if it's to go to Texas and get some drugs and bring them back up to Kansas.
Well, and that's what I'm saying is as challenged with these problems, it really has been about the patients. By the way, if it was about the politics and the MDs back 100 years ago and anyone else, we would have been killed. We would have been gone. Why we've survived is the patient, and why I do what I do. And I know Dr. Heather Rudy, we want osteopathy to be so entrenched and the history so preserved that it will never go away. My wife, my children, myself, we have all benefited. It's the patients that have refused to let it go away. And this is why it's transferred into a global profession. It's the patients. Everyone else is trying to, you're in our turf, you're taking our money, you're making our patients better. We don't like it. You're making us look bad. And so it's like, but we don't go away. It's because of the patients.
Well, let's circle back a little bit more into the past there, because there's some interesting history. When you talked about that first class and all those physicians or want to be physicians went off and started their own schools, that actually created another kind of, I'll call it a catastrophe or disaster within our profession. Can you talk a little bit about what happened with those schools and the power struggle that emitted in our early history when we started having all these schools being created quickly?
Well, and that's true. As the schools grew, they all used the original school as their footprint. So why we were so solid for Flexner was everyone who graduated looked back to their school and said, well, when I create a school, I want to be just like mom. And so we're going to have the same programs. We're going to do our own private, our journal monthly. We're going to have all the same, criteria. And so really it was just like stamping out these great professional schools because they knew what was successful. However, that became a challenge because as more schools developed all over the United States, patients and students didn't want to come to Kirksville. If you've been to Kirksville, it is still today impossible to get here. Now, Dr. Still said, well, I want this so that osteopathy doesn't get lost. Well, it is true. Where we're at, it is osteopathy. In Chicago and in Kansas City and in New York, maybe if he'd started there, it would have vanished. But he says, I want it to be isolated because my baby will grow. However, it's hard to get here for patients and students. And so as these other schools developed, people stopped coming to Kirksville and the schools started to atrophy in patients and students, and it was desperate. So the family looked around and said, we got a problem. There were 23 schools. So because you're thinking like, what? Now we're 56 plus. I can't keep up with all the new schools. ACOM every 6 months there's like another school somewhere. But I know we're up to 56 and we could be higher. So if I'm off, I'm still shocked at that. So what had happened, we had 23 schools and the powerful early schools started buying and closing. Because they bring the students then to Kirksville and tell the faculty, I'm sorry, I guess you're going to have to do clinical work. We don't find the school profitable. This is what big corporations do today. They basically eat the young and then you only have a few choices. I don't know if you want to talk about that, Dr. Brown, or
Yeah, no, I think we had a good conversation about this where you talked about how schools were buying each other and then closing each other. And I think this is something that we should address, because I do think that while we talk about the great growth of osteopathic medicine, there was a time frame where we were a set amount of schools for a very long time. It's only been the recent history that we have suddenly exploded to, and I just looked it up, it's 36 accredited colleges with 57 campuses currently. So that's where we are today. But we stayed a very small amount for a very long time. And I think this conversation we had it shows it's because of one of the big mistakes we made, or a lot of us made.
The idea is, had we not closed off those schools, which were quality schools, would we have been more competitive in would he have taken us more seriously? But when we're 9 schools and then we consolidated 2 more schools down to basically 7, at the time of the Flexner report, we were pretty puny. We weren't even 10% of the 66 MD schools. But what I'm saying, being 10%, we didn't carry any weight. If we had been 23 schools, or maybe accepted a few more, would we have been half the medical profession? And so it really did, in some ways, this potential for growth 100 years ago got stagnated. And then, of course, being what we are, we've exploded in the last 20 years. And so it makes an interesting point. What if we hadn't been so greedy? And I should say, it wasn't Dr. Still. To some degree, it was his children. They liked their mansions and they liked their big cars and their European travel, and they wanted to perpetuate this at the cost of the idea of osteopathy. Now, give Charlie his due. As an old man in his 80s, he looked back at what they had done and he said, I sometimes wonder if we should have just taught it for free. Kind of the musings of an old man, realizing what he and his siblings had done to their father's great idea. They knew osteopathy was great, but they used it for themselves. And so, you know, kind of interesting.
You told me a story about, as they were doing this buying frenzy where one school would buy another school and then just to close it so that way they'd be competitive. Yeah. You shared me an interesting story about the Des Moines school, which I thought was interesting, about how they had been participating in this and then found themselves almost a victim of it. And yet the faculty banded together and actually saved. And I thought that was a great story of how the faculty of a school helped save the school. Could you tell us more about that?
Those Iowegians, they're too smart for their own good. There's a reason why they have the first basically when we're looking at the presidents and stuff, they always have the first primaries and things, because that's Iowa. They want they don't play the game the way everyone else plays. So let me show you again. I'm going to share my screen because I think this will help us understand it a little bit better. See if it'll, yep. So we'll go on down to, and these are some interesting things. So one of the things we started doing is we were looking at the charters, because, one of the ways that we could get rid of schools is if the charter wasn't correct, then the state would close down the school. So we were very cutthroat. We would go and call up the governments and say, hey, you've got an osteopathic school. Is that osteopathic school legitimately chartered? And now most of them, would look and say, yeah, it appears it was. And but sometimes they came back and said, well, why do you care? I mean, you're in Missouri, we're in Pennsylvania. What is your business? What charters we have or not? Well, they had a quick reply. It was like, well, if a student from Pennsylvania leaves after a year and wants to come to our school, we just want to make sure it's legitimate. But what they really wanted to do was close it down. And so they're buying schools. So Des Moines actually bought the Minnesota school, which I understand there's a new one being opened up by Barbara Ross Lee and Dr. Kuchera, I think, are pioneering a new school in Minnesota. But what I'm saying, there had already been one there. And Des Moines had bought it and closed it. And there was one in North Dakota that they bought and closed. And there was one in Denver that they bought. So Des Moines was a pretty big powerhouse. And it was one of the earliest schools because it was started by A.T. Still's brother, James, and his kid, Summerfield. So there was a family connection to Des Moines. So Des Moines was very powerful. So after a lot of these schools had been bought, Kirksville kind of makes a deal with Summerfield, the nephew of A.T. Still, and says, look, Summerfield, sell your school. We'll bring you down to Kirksville for a sweetheart vice president job. And we're going to get rid of this competition and we'll be even more powerful. Well, so Summerfield says, good deal. And if we look, what they did is the Iowa school was familiar, Des Moines school was familiar what was going on. They said, whoa, you're going to close us. It's like, no. We're going to combine Kirksville and Des Moines, and we're going to really control the middle of the United States. That we think we respect you. We're not going to close you. So on this diploma from 1905, when this transition happened of us acquiring the Des Moines school, A.T. Still even signs off at the bottom. You can see his signature. A.T. Still, he was emeritus faculty of osteopathy. So we even have Dr. Still signing the diploma in 1905. But what's funny is, as soon as this class graduated, we make the announcement in May, literally weeks later, saying, we're going to close the school. We don't find it profitable. And of course, the faculty were all upset. It's like, see, we knew you were going to do this. And they're going to finish their work at the ASO. We're going to bring just what we've been doing. Well, this faculty pause and they say, wait a minute. The Kirksville school didn't buy our school. They bought a building. We, the faculty, are the school, and the students are our students. They bought a building. Good luck. Students, we are going to start a brand new school. Give us a couple weeks, and we're going to continue on as if nothing happened. So the Des Moines school founds a new college, if you look to the right. Well, this had never happened. No school has ever resisted being closed. And it kind of freaked out the children of Dr. Steele, because it's like, what happened? We closed you, you're supposed to close. And they picked on old Summerfield, saying, you messed it up. Well, he got his sweetheart vice president job. He sold the school and he came to Kirksville, because after he did that, he had no friends in Des Moines. Well, they started up, they were going to buy a new building. Well, we didn't want the building, it's worthless. So we kind of placated Des Moines faculty. Hey, sorry, you can buy the building back and all's good. Well, the faculty said, yeah, no, we're going to get a better building. Well, we didn't want the building. So we gave them a very huge discount. It was a huge money loser. And basically, they finally bought their building back for pennies on the dollar. And that was the last school that we tried to close. So it's interesting.
I love that story, just because it just shows the faculty and the students getting together and what kind of difference they could make. And it makes me wonder, and I'll ask you this question, what do you think, where do you think we would be if we'd learned to be more collaborative back during that time, if schools weren't so competitive against each other? Do you think this had an effect on osteopathic medicine and kind of limited us in those earlier years?
Well, and that's the idea. Aside from each school fighting the other schools, instead of having a consortium where we're all coming along together, which granted, we see that today. The deans and the faculty get together with ACOM, and we share information on recruiting students. And how we've gotten so big to be 25% is from our collaboration, not from our being in our own little foxholes fighting and lobbing bombs at each other. So really, it was to our disadvantage that we didn't collaborate. And I want to show you one other document that shows where we changed things. So I'm going to share the screen really quick, and here we go. And it had to do with the Association of Colleges of Osteopathy, which was the predecessor to
ACOM.
oops, there it is. Sorry. It was basically ACOM. Today would have been the ACO of yesteryear. And so if we look to the page to the left, we see the American School withdraws from the Associated Colleges of Osteopathy. So the children of AT still tell the association that we're not going to be a member. Now, what kind of association do you have if the founding school is not a member? You've got the College of Osteopathy, and the original school has nothing to do with you. The reason, it goes back to money. You see, we were quite content with a 2-year program because we could get the students in and out and get that $500 tuition, every 2 years. If we had 3 years, we weren't going to make as much money or have as many students. And so the idea was that it wasn't profitable. And so we resisted, where the ACO was moving towards higher and quality education. We're kind of happy with what we were doing. Now, in the end, we went to 3 years, and then we went to 4 years. But what the children said was, we don't think the ACO should be making the decisions on accreditation and certification. We're going to support the AOA. Now, why would the founding school want to give the power of curriculum and certification and license? Why would we want to do that with the AOA? Because being the first school, more graduates came from Kirksville, and therefore AOA would give more power to the founding school. So it was a logical move to push power and decision-making to the AOA, because we would have more graduates. And I look today, more presidents, when we go through it, Kirksville has been very active with the AOA. So this was one of the reasons this was done. And again, to some degree, it tangled things up a little bit.
I suppose I can't make any comments on that. If you look at the MAOPS leadership tends to be a little Kirksville heavy as well. Um, but we
Right,
invite
there
we,
are two other colleges.
we invite graduates of all schools to participate in MAOPS leadership. We again, I'll probably just have to stop my comments on that one and go from there.
Well, no, but let me continue
But,
though.
but I
When
am
I
very
go to
proud of my school training.
But when I go to MAOPS, what I'm impressed with the faculty from the other schools, from KCU and KCU Joplin, what I'm saying is in seeing the Wenzel, scholars and the working together of our students, what I'm saying is among our schools, I don't think the students see any animosity. As a matter of fact, Dr. Hahn is very inviting and very supportive of the work in the founding school and very gracious. I was just talking to him last week about, transferring a bust of AT Still, the same one that's at the Capitol and that you have at MAOPS, putting at the KCU school. And that's what I'm saying. We really have a great relationship. So I do think it is kind of fun. But again, give its due. MAOPS began at the Kirksville campus the year after the AOA began at the Kirksville campus. Back then, the AAAO. Too many A's.
We love our acronyms. No, and you are right. I do feel like there's such great collaboration among schools, and never felt any competition, or have felt any competition between them, which tells you how far we've come. And I think that speaks to our rapid growth and having those 57 campuses now. We found that schools collaborating and starting these new campuses has become a great way to build these new schools. And it's just amazing to watch our profession continue to grow, and to overcome it. I mean, that's definitely, when I look back on this history, I can't help but think about how we did kind of shackle ourselves, because we weren't collaborative, and we were being so eager to just pursue those financial reasons. The same thing that shut down the very first school to begin with. So it's amazing what we've done now that we're collaborating and moving forward as a profession. And it is, we've definitely grown. Briefly, we got a few minutes left here. I want to briefly kind of jump to the future, because we mentioned our California experience. We've talked about some more ancient, we'll call ancient, some more older, disasters that we faced. Can you briefly talk about the California experience and how we overcame that as well? And
I think, and I'm going to answer one quick question because I see Logan Banks, another
Yeah.
one of our great students and alum. Logan asked, what was the criteria? Well, in the Flexner report, one of the criteria against us was that students were accepted with less, with a high school diploma. But the reality of it was that all medical schools accepted people with a high school diploma because 8th grade was the average education in 1900s of anybody. That was it. But what we did is we looked at what Flexner wrote, and our school said, you're right. Probably some of our students don't, we expect them to have some college, and maybe they don't have the sciences. So basically, we set up a program to give a master's of science while the students were getting their physician degree to strengthen their science background. The interesting thing is that decision that happened back in Dr. Still's time is still part of our campus today with our Masters of Biosciences. So it was a way that we thought we could help our students be better prepared to come to medical school. So Logan, that's a great question. And again, it shows you how we're innovative, and that works today. Now, California, that animosity back in the 60s was like, we're going to stop these DOs, and we know how to do it. We're going to let the DOs in California be equally accepted and licensed as an MD. And they're to turn in their DO licensing. We will reissue an MD license, and we will get rid of the DOs. See, the thought of the Californians, the arrogance of those medical doctors was all DOs really in their hearts wanted to be an MD. They didn't. And that's where their mistake was. Now, some of them did and accepted it because they were living in California. But what happened is when they equally licensed the DOs, the government said, wait a minute, UMDs have just on your own acknowledged DOs are equal. Henceforth, there can be no discrimination in the United States for DOs. And we didn't have to change. If anything, it gave us the argument that we can remain as we are. They thought everybody would turn in their degrees and become MDs, and that would be the end. And it's like, no, we're not. We're actually very proud of the skills we have and our whole person lifestyle. And so they really shot themselves kind of in the foot, meaning that they made it so that all the last states, which I think were down in Mississippi, Alabama, it was some southern states, not to pick on those schools, but they were the last holdouts to discriminate against DOs practicing. And after what California did, no state could. And so it was in the 70s that osteopathy and could practice anywhere. And that was the beginning of the end of the osteopathic hospitals. If we could practice anywhere, we didn't need our own personal hospitals. Those were just because we were being discriminated against. The funny thing is, California never really treated their DOs well. They called them MDs, but they called them little MDs. they were still considered less. And that kind of upset those DOs. And so they welcomed in new schools of osteopathy once the government got involved. So it's an interesting lesson.
Very interesting. And again, I love the story because it shows a time of hardship, and but then we see what came out of it. You know, it actually, you know, advanced the profession. And so it's great because, you know, when you go back to all these stories of difficulties we had, I don't ever see the outcome not being, and the profession grew.
And so that's what I'm saying is through these struggles, we've learned and we've prepared ourselves. We give the best education. And again, the profession has grown. When we look at 57, you know, locations where you can be trained as a DO, it's amazing. And hundreds worldwide that practice the concept and philosophy of whole person health. And as we see today in this time of this disease, if you're healthy, you have the best opportunity to survive. And Dr. Steele said that from day one. The best way to fight disease is health. Your diet, your exercise, your mental health, the natural flow of your body of nutrition in and waste out, that will help you in the toughest situations. And it still holds true today.
Absolutely. And, you know, we talked about this with our last chat, just about how, you know, that is still with this COVID pandemic has been the best treatment option and the steadiest treatment option we found being posted by anyone is don't be the sick person. And so, you know, promoting health is definitely been a great thing. I do want to highlight Jared Nichols' comments here. They're great comments. So, you know, we just had this first combined ACGME match. And we had 90% of our osteopathic medical students match in this match. That's a far cry from when 0% of ACGME programs accepted osteopathic physicians to now 90% in the United States are matching into these programs in this combined match. And we definitely have grown a long way, and we've come a long way here. Yeah. So he brings up an interesting question, which I'm going to defer over to you. There. And by the way, you know, I think we've got time for questions now here. So anybody who has other questions, please feel free to type them into the chat there as we're talking about these. So please, you know, now's a great time to type in some general questions. But he brings up the question: are we shooting ourselves in the foot by having so many DO schools opening up, but we're not opening up more ONMM, you know, specialty, I guess I would say programs, or having as many physicians focus on osteopathic manipulation treatment?
Well, you know, and Dr. Brown, it comes sometimes back to the money issue. You know, the cost of medical education, as you can probably attest to, that OMM takes so much longer and activity where, you know, when I normally see my physician, if I see them for 10 or 15 minutes, it's a long time. You know, I come in, I'm mostly checking for, you know, do I have strep throat, or, you know, did I injure myself? But it really is very quickly. And so, you know, we're always told, but if you know how to, you know, charge correctly, blah, 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 it shouldn't be an issue. but it is, the difference is, can I see 6 patients in an hour or 2 patients in an hour? And ultimately the money, catches up with that. And so I do think that one of the challenges, we believe in OMM, it's just very time consuming and therefore very cost restrictive. And until we find out a way of working at that, we're going to continue to find people moving away from doing it. And DOs referring to chiropractors because it's like, well, they know the basics, so that should work. Um,
I agree with your comments on that, Jason, and I know there'll be people that have different opinions of this. For me, I see the salvation of osteopathic manipulative treatment is a renewed emphasis on how to integrate it fully into practice. So, when I had my education at that wonderful school started by A.T. Still, osteopathic medicine was still, or osteopathic manipulative treatment was an isolated subject in an isolated time in an isolated part of my day in an isolated lab within the building. And it was taught by different teachers and different instructors than those that taught me the physical exam skills, the family medicine skills, and those things. They were starting to integrate that. And I know a lot of schools have started to do a much better job of integrating it into the curriculum. But at the time I was there, it was only briefly. And so the problem with that is that if I practice osteopathic medicine as a family medicine physician in a rural town that only has 2 doctors for 12,000 patients or 12,000 people, now mathematically I cannot treat that many patients. Even 6,000 is not mathematically possible to do a good job. So to be able to incorporate OMT into that as well makes it a very difficult scenario. And so what works for me is being able to integrate that into parts of my day, into parts of my visits, and to be able to have it very, I jump from treating that sore throat to doing this to, doing this to doing that. And so for me, the salvation is really emphasizing how we break in or put osteopathic manipulation into the everyday workflow, not just the isolated visit like Jared Nichols doing, where he has an hour for that new patient and a half an hour for his follow-up. I think that's wonderful. That's great. My employer would fire me on the spot if that was the volume that I was doing. I wouldn't be able to pay the light bills. I wouldn't be able to see all the patients here in this town. Now I could have a different model. I could open up a smaller practice, smaller staff, and cut my costs. But then I'd be treating less people in my community. So it's a mix. It really is. I've got 4 chiropractors in town and only 2 physicians. And so it's really hard, to do that. So yeah.
Well, and I love what Marty Levine, AOA president, graduate of our school, as he said, find ways that you can always do a little OMM, whether it's headaches. There's always a little. Never let a patient leave without doing a little adjustment. And I remember when he talked to our students, try that, but I know it's hard because it's not a quick fix. And it's frustrating for me when I want to get an OMM treatment. It's like, well, we can get you in a month. Dr. Still is, I go over there, the grave is just turned, the soil is just turned. I can tell that he's just flipping in there because at my school, you have to wait a month. And it's like, yeah, it's hard.
Well, and I think we've got young doctors like Jared Nichols who are going to be able to teach that and integrate that. And we've got more integrated curriculums as we watch them develop. So it's not an isolated subject in an isolated room at an isolated time, but it's integrated over the curriculum and over the span. And I think that's going to help our students more to see it in that light, as opposed to being this separate thing that they complete. Yeah. Alicia King asks about, are you aware of any problems that we had in Europe or the rest of the world outside of the United States? Or is that a loaded question?
You mean again, politically, osteopaths are seen as cutting into the chiropractor's patient load, physician patient load, and getting it. The funny thing is where the governments accept it and pay equally, and it's not a competition, it works very well. And what we're seeing is countries like Belgium and Portugal, and what we're seeing is that in Germany, where it is becoming part of their education. When the Germans accept it, it's got to be good, because as my wife says, if it's in Germany, it works. And it I think it says a lot that osteopathic manipulative medicine is now taught as a form of university education in medicine and is accepted fully. And so as a result, some of my colleagues who are DOs are teaching the history, because it is required that once it becomes part of your formal education, the history of it has to be talked about too. And so they're actually getting out of book publishing and those kinds of things in osteopathy as DOs, and actually teaching in the major universities of Europe. And they just did 2 documentaries showing the hands that heal, because it is a collaborative work within the medical field. And so I do think that it's going to come more and more throughout the world, that manipulative medicine aspects of osteopathy and the whole health philosophy that goes with it, we're seeing more and more of it. Okay.
Any other questions that people might have on the panel here? Jared brings up, the point of, we've got these allopathic people who are following our model minus the OMN portion, which I think is good. I mean, to me, that's an integrated, they're trying to integrate medicine into all aspects, not being that siloed treating. But for me, what makes me feel different and what I love is that, I'll have a patient come into me for something that doesn't appear to be something I would normally treat with osteopathic medicine. But over the course of talking to the patient, I realize, this patient has something that's musculoskeletal that I can easily treat him here in the clinic. I can offer him that treatment. I don't have to refer him. And we can provide a great, whole patient experience. So I think the most important thing is we just always keep our thinking caps on about how can I, integrate, osteopathic medicine into this as well.
Well, and I think one last thing, and I saw a question that came up from Jared, but I almost fell over just before we paused. We never closed AT. Our university case never closed. We paused, and now we're unpausing. But just before the pause, we had 6 MDs through the OPTI program, I believe, that were there to learn and understand the manipulative aspects of our education and treatment. And that to me is, again, things we never thought we would see. MDs coming for training and manipulation at AT Still University. And so again, I do think Jared is going to be able to work and do great things, as Logan and stuff, in bringing about what we have to offer for the whole person and treatment. So.
Right, absolutely. Those basic tenets that were set forth by AT Still have just stood this test of time, and have just been a wonderful route for us to fall back on. It's been wonderful. So I think we're about out of time. If we don't have any further questions, Jason, again, very, very grateful for you and your time here. Always very informative. And Heather, thank you also. We would challenge you to please learn as much as Jason has about AT Still, so that way you can continue to allow this to be a part of our culture for these new osteopathic medical students as they move forward.
Okay, thanks. We'll see you again. Let's do this again.
Thank you. Absolutely. We'll come up with some even more topics. And if you have any great topic ideas for Jason and I, please email us. Let us know. Email either of us. We're always looking for good topics, things that we think would be helpful to you. We realize that this might seem historical, but I think it's just very important for us to strengthen our roots during this time, to realize, even better what a great profession we are, because we are such a wonderful profession and we have such great, strong roots. So thank you, Jason. Thank you, everybody.
Have a good evening. Bye.